Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another episode of AAHP, otherwise known as Another American History Podcast. Today, we will be continuing our discussion about Columbus, his arrival in the Americas, the natives he encountered, and how they were treated. Also, we would like to share a warning to our listeners that this episode includes mentions of extreme violence, sexual assault, death, and other unsettling or unpleasant topics. Please be aware and listen at your own discretion. My name is Isaiah, and I have the honor of being your narrator today. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. If you're returning from the last episode, welcome back. We release a new episode every month, and you can check us out on our socials if you liked what you heard here. Now, without further ado, pop in those headphones, at a safe volume of course, and take in the history. After several stressful, unsure weeks at sea, Columbus and his men had at long last set eyes on what they thought to be Asia. After years of campaigning, petitioning, begging, and estrangement, it seemed like Christopher's life's goal was finally within reach, only a few hours away. But thanks to the power of hindsight, of course we know he hadn't reached anywhere near Asia. In fact, he was on the wrong side of the planet. At dawn on October 12, 1492, Columbus and his fleet landed on an island in the Bahamas archipelago, which he promptly named San Salvador, reportedly in honor of Jesus Christ for having granted his fleet safe travel. The island was, of course, like all places Columbus discovered, already inhabited and named. The natives referred to the island as Guanahani, which loosely translates to small upper waters land, likely due to the pond or lake which Columbus and his men reported to be in the center of the otherwise flat and tree-covered island. The name is derived from the Taino people who inhabited the island. More specifically, they were the Lucayan, a branch of the Taino who inhabited the Guanahani and the nearby surrounding islands. Unbeknownst to any of them at the time, Columbus's arrival on their islands was essentially a death sentence for the Lucacari, as they referred to themselves, as within 30 years their people would be enslaved, mutilated, and murdered by the Spanish to such a degree that by 1520 they had been completely eradicated. Despite this, there were other branches who spoke the same language and shared a similar culture. In fact, there are many people today in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the surrounding islands who have claimed Taino descent or identify as Taino themselves. Columbus, of course, knew none of this about the indigenous people he encountered and made little effort to learn. Instead, he dubbed the people Indios after his mistaken belief that he had successfully reached the East Indies. Of course, this mistake would be echoed throughout history, with the indigenous people of America commonly being referred to as Indians. Not to mention the fact that the islands he landed on are still referred to as the West Indies, an unfortunate reminder of his mistaken location. Of the myriad of people he encountered, Columbus always took thorough, if inaccurate or assumptuous records. This is what Columbus had to say of the Lucayans, and I quote, "Many of the men I have seen have scars on their bodies. When I made signs to them to find out how this happened, they indicated that people from other nearby islands came to San Salvador to capture them. They defend themselves the best way they can. I believe that people from the mainland come here to take them as slaves. They ought to make good and skilled servants, for they repeat very quickly whatever we say to them. I think they can very easily be made Christians, for they seem to have no religion. If it pleases our Lord, I will take 6 of them to your highness when I depart, in order that they may learn our language." Despite the natives' initial friendly reception of Columbus and his men, he would follow through on his promise, kidnapping several of them and returning to Spain with them during his first voyage, and doing the same to hundreds more on his subsequent trips. On top of his initial descriptions of the natives, Columbus also made note in his records that the people were largely unarmed, and in his eyes would be easy for the Spanish crown to conquer. In recognition of this belief, he performed an official claiming ceremony of the island, planting a flag and declaring it for the King and Queen of Spain, considering it officially conquered by this act alone. The next 2 days after landing, Columbus and his men continued to explore the island and maintain a relatively peaceful relations with the natives. They traded with them, exchanging things such as glass beads and bells in exchange for much more valuable local goods and supplies which they beleaguered soldiers desperately needed. Columbus also noted that many of the Lucayans had golden ornaments or jewelry and set about trying to find the source of the gold through his rough communication tactics. Over time, he came to understand that much of it had come from other islands, which further incentivized him to keep traveling. On October 18th, with new supplies and several slaves in tow, Columbus made a decision to move on from San Salvador. believing himself to be near mainland Asia and the immense treasure he had promised to return to Spain with. For 10 days, they sailed around other small islands, such as modern-day Rum Cay and Long Island, searching for larger islands or the mainland while continuing their practices of trading trinkets for goods and capturing slaves to bring back to Europe. After deducting that they were larger land masses to the south, based on the information provided to him by the Taino people, on October 25th, the fleet set out from the Bahamas. On October 28th, they once again made landfall. Given the size of the landmass and the massive amount of beautiful vegetation, Columbus initially believed they had finally reached mainland Asia. But they had in fact landed on the northeastern coast of modern-day Cuba. At first, reflecting his belief that he had reached the mainland, Columbus named the island Juana, after the son of Queen Isabella, Juan. They spent the next several days exploring the coastline of Cuba, completely unaware of its island status, documenting its lush vegetation and potential to be hiding gold, which the men and Columbus were ever seeking. On occasion, they would land to trade with the native Taino people as they encountered them, questioning them about where they might find gold or other valuable resources. Columbus also took painstaking notes about the geography, flora, fauna, and general landscape, hoping that his documentation would be helpful to later expeditions to and colonization of the land. This process of sailing, landing, trading, documenting, and sailing again continued into early November. On November 5th, he decided to send 2 men on a scouting mission further inland to see what they might discover. One of these men was Luis de Torres, a translator who spoke both Hebrew and Arabic, which might have been valuable skills had Columbus been anywhere near where he thought he was. The 2 men, led by Taino guides, observed the local customs, agricultural practices, and general landscape. They also documented one of the first European encounters with tobacco, one of the plants which would come to dominate the Western economy in the coming centuries. But, failing to find any massive gold deposits sitting out in the open, the men returned to the convoy and the journey continued. After several more days of exploration and documentation, Columbus finally came to the conclusion that the island may not be the Asian mainland he'd expected, and made the decision to move on in search of the real thing. On November 12th, their small fleet departed from Cuba for another island which Columbus named Hispaniola, but which the natives referred to as Haiti, an island which Columbus believed the natives had indicated was rich in resources and, more importantly, gold. Up until November 20th, they sailed in general calmness, with little being reported other than casual observations and general discontent that comes from being away from home and at sea for too long. On November 21st, however, a major change came in an unexpected way. The Pinta disappeared into darkness. Martin Alonso Pinzon, the captain of the Pinta, and one of the Pinzon brothers we discussed earlier, either ignored or missed a direct order from Columbus to change course, and his ship was separated from the fleet. There is some contention over this event, whether he intentionally separated from Columbus or not, and what his intentions were, but it is generally agreed that he intentionally made the break in order to make his own discoveries of the land, and more importantly, gold. Martin continued on his own course and did in fact come across other islands, most notably of which is believed to have been Haiti. It was certainly Columbus's belief that Martin had betrayed him. He feared that Martin may have been taking his discoveries and riches and made a run for Spain in the faster sailing Pinta, becoming the first to bring the monarchs news of their voyage. He also feared that Martin would tell them lies about his conduct, resulting in more than a loss of credit if he was not there to defend himself. It would not be for several weeks, until January 6th, that his fears would be put to bed as the missing ship was spotted in the distance and rejoined them for their journey home. In the meantime, Columbus and his 2 remaining ships continued on their journey to Hispaniola. The day after the Pinta's disappearance, November 22nd, they made landfall on the island, which Columbus noted as being particularly beautiful and lush, and would be good for our agricultural practices. They were welcomed warmly by the Taino people living there, as they had been everywhere so far, and continued their unbalanced trade practices of exchanging trinkets for goods. He also questioned them about the gold he'd been seeking, and to his delight, the Taino people seemed to indicate that it could be found further inland on the island. Even at this point, Columbus was making plans for colonization. He would regularly make note of the island's natural resources, the successful Taino people agricultural practices, and the ease of which he believed they could be conquered or enslaved. Based on what he had heard about nearby gold deposits, as well as the island's central location within the Caribbean, he began to eye it as a potential settlement point and foothold for the Spanish. He also believed that due to the Taino's openness, willingness to trade, general friendliness, as well as what he perceived to be simplicity and a lack of structured religion, that they would not only assist in setting up a colony, but be willing converts to Christianity. Columbus's exploration of Hispaniola continued into December as the fleet continued along the northern coast of the island. As they maneuvered, he kept track of important landmarks and potential settlement sites, but kept his eye focused on finding a gold deposit that he might exploit and return to Spain with, proving the value of his journey. But it was not all quote-unquote smooth sailing. On the day before Christmas, December 24th, 1492, having not gotten much sleep for 2 days and with calm seas, Columbus finally decided to turn in and rest. Given the acceptable weather, the steersman aboard the Santa Maria decided to sleep as well, and laid down, leaving only a cabin boy to steer, something Columbus himself had expressively forbidden. Whether this decision was made to give the boy more experience because he had asked for it, or because they truly did not see the risk, the results were the same. While the currents were calm, they still proved too much for the young man, and the ship was carried onto a sandbank, running aground just off the present-day Haiti on the island of Hispaniola. Unable to plug the holes and fix the damage, the ship steadily took on water, finally sinking the next day on Christmas. Despite his fury, Columbus did not view the obvious catastrophe as a complete setback. Instead, he looked for a way to exploit the opportunity it presented. He had already intended to establish a settlement on the island, given its abundant resources, friendly natives, and reports of gold, and immediately ordered his men to strip the ship for parts to begin building a fort. As he wrote in his journal, quote, "I have ordered a tower and fortress to be constructed, and a large cellar, not because I believe there is any necessity on account of the natives. I am certain the people I have with me could subjugate all of this island, as the population are naked and without arms and very cowardly." End quote. Despite this assertion, he did still seek permission from the local chieftain, Guacanagari, before leaving the men behind on his island. Naming the fort Puerto de la Navidad, or Christmas Port after the day which the ship had sunk, Columbus appointed Diego de Arana to govern the fortress and the 39 men he intended to leave behind to inhabit and guard it. They equipped the fort as best as they could, supplying it with provisions, goods, and even artillery before preparing to set off. La Navidad would officially be the first European settlement in the New World, but it would not be a long-lasting one, as we will discuss in a few moments. With the settlement on its feet and, in Columbus's eyes, ready to defend itself, he set off with the intention to locate his missing ship, the Pinta, and begin their return journey to Spain. By now, the ship had been missing several weeks, and Columbus's anxiety over the situation was steadily growing. But as mentioned earlier, after nearly a week of searching on January 6, 1493, they finally spotted it approaching from the east. When they finally reconvened, it was a less than pleasant exchange that followed. Columbus was furious with Martin Alonso, accusing him of disobeying direct orders to seek treasure and glory for himself, while Martin was furious that Columbus intended to leave nearly 40 men behind in a practically unknown land with, in his eyes, little hope of survival. In the end, Martin would prove to be in the right. Not only did Columbus receive all the credit and glory for the expedition, but in the settlement of La Navidad did not even survive 12 months. When Columbus returned nearly a year later in November 1493, he would find the settlement destroyed and his men dead or missing. After some investigation, he discovered that shortly after their departure, the men he had left behind began to bicker amongst themselves, filled with greed and jealousy over the gold and women they had begun to steal from the natives on the island. Eventually, they had broken up into groups, with some going in search of gold mines while others remained at the fort. This division allowed both groups to be easily overrun by, at this point, incensed indigenous people who were furious with the Europeans for their theft and kidnappings. Some of the Spaniards had taken several women each without regard for their own wants or existent families. But Columbus and his men would not know the fates of these men for nearly a year, so for the moment Columbus, an admiral, won the argument over Martin, a captain, and they prepared to sail home in what was probably a pretty awkward silence. On January 13th, the ships made their final stop in the Americas on the northeastern coast of Hispaniola. Here, for the first time, he was not met with overwhelming kindness from the natives, and in return, he killed them for it. Encountering the Siwayos, a native population that appears to have predated even the Taino, He attempted to trade with them for bows and arrows, but was rebuffed. A clash broke out between the two groups, and in the fighting, one Siwayo was stabbed in the buttocks, while another received an arrow to his chest. After successfully escaping, Columbus would subsequently name the inlet the Bay of Arrows. Around this time, Columbus was also informed by some of the natives aboard his fleet of two other islands he had not visited, the island de Caribe, which was reportedly inhabited by cannibalistic people, and the island Matinio, an island which was inhabited solely by women. Still believing himself to be in Asia, Columbus associated this second island with another in the Indian Ocean, which he had read reports on by Marco Polo. On January 16, 1493, the two remaining ships began their long journey back across the Atlantic Ocean. The first month or so was relatively calm, with regular winds and speed carrying them. But on February 13th, things took a turn for the worse. A massive storm, the worst they had encountered thus far on their journey, overtook them. The two ships were temporarily separated and lost contact as they each struggled to remain afloat, and things got so bad that all hands aboard the Nina vowed to make a pilgrimage to the nearest church of Our Lady, or the Virgin Mary, as she's more commonly referred to today, should they survive the ordeal. Despite the close call, on the morning of February 15th, everyone breathed a sigh of relief as land was spotted. Columbus correctly assumed they had reached the Portuguese Azores Island, and on the night of February 17th, made anchor. But the cable snapped, leaving the Nina adrift until the next morning when a safer landing location was located further along the coast. After sending a few sailors ashore, who subsequently learned of an even safer spot to land, thus moving the ship once more, they encountered more of the local islanders whom they promptly informed of their vow, and who in turn told them of the nearest shrine dedicated to Mary. Columbus split the crew in half, sending one group ashore to fulfill their vow, while the second half would do so on the first group's return. However, the first party did not come back. Instead, they were taken prisoner by the island's captain, a man named João de Castanheira, who believed the party may have been a group of pirates. Following this assumption, João took their landing boat and used it to sail, along with several of his armed men, out to the Nina, where he intended to arrest the rest of the crew as well as Columbus. Christopher refused to cooperate, however, relaying their true journey and denying any accusations of piracy, but João did not believe him, denouncing the Spaniards and returning to the island. There is some discrepancy over what happened over the next couple of days, whether Columbus himself was captured or the prisoners managed to convince João their story was true, but in the end the result was the same. João released the captured sailors and permitted them to return to their ship, and they continued on towards Europe. While he had intended to sail straight for Castilian Spain, yet another storm interrupted them, blowing them off course and forcing them instead to Lisbon, where they anchored next to a patrol ship on March 4th. The men aboard the patrol ship informed them that a fleet of 100 ships had been lost in the last storm, and everyone reacted with shock that both the Nina and the Pinta had been spared such a fate. Columbus, eager to share the news of his voyage, wrote to King John II of Portugal, who agreed to meet with him despite the poor relations between Portugal and Spain at the time. Despite his shock at Columbus's claims, John was still less than thrilled to learn of the voyage, believing it violated the 1479 Treaty of Alcobendas, which had recognized Portuguese hegemony in the Atlantic Ocean and divided overseas territory into two separate zones of influence. After a week of rest in Portugal, they once again set sail for Spain, this time reaching their destination on March 15, 1493, traveling to Barcelona to meet with Ferdinand and Isabella. Columbus reported his findings. He showed them the trinkets he had taken, such as gold samples, pearls, and jewelry, as well as some of the local fauna and flora like the hitherto unknown tobacco plant, pineapples, and the turkey. He also showed off several of his kidnapping victims, and continued to insist that he had reached Asia, a belief that became prevalent not just between him and his men, but the monarchs, the Pope, and much of Europe. Only one man at the time seemed to realize the extent of what Columbus had uncovered. The historian Peter Martyr described Columbus as the discoverer of, quote, a new world, in a letter dated November 1st, 1493. Columbus exaggerated much of what he had found in a letter addressed to the Spanish court, which reads, quote, Hispaniola is a miracle. Mountains and hills, plains and pastures are both fertile and beautiful. The harbors are unbelievably good, and there are many wide rivers which the majority contain gold. There are many spices and great mines of gold and other metals. End quote. Following this revelation, the Pope promptly determined how the new land would be divided between Spain and Portugal by designing a line which separated much of the new territory in half and as a boon to Columbus and the monarchs of Spain, included his discoveries on their half of the line. This voyage marked an important turning point not just in Spanish or even European history, but the world. Never again would the indigenous people of Americas know peace, nor would their trade routes and economies of Europe and Asia remain the same. For better or for worse, the New World had been officially discovered, and everything from the flow of trade to military strategies would change. Though the first voyage we've spent the last few episodes discussing is the most well-known of Columbus's journeys, it is by no means his only one. Just as several of his crew would make several more trips to the Americas, so too would Columbus. On his second voyage, which lasted from September 25th, 1493 to 1496, Columbus would focus much of his attention on converting the indigenous people of the islands to Christianity and establishing a more permanent presence in the Caribbean. This time, he would be granted an entire fleet to sail with a total of 17 ships under his command, including a return of the Niña from his first voyage. They were met with a much more violent resistance to their invasion on this journey. For instance, they encountered a canoe with Carib men and 2 women who were transporting 2 recently castrated captives. When the Europeans tried to pursue them, they were met with arrows, with at least one Spaniard fatally succumbing to his injuries. They did eventually capture the canoe, and subsequently killed nearly all of those aboard. One man, who had been thrown overboard, was spotted crawling away carrying his entrails, and was then recaptured and thrown overboard once again. One of the captured women, however, was not killed. Instead, Columbus gave her as a slave to his childhood friend whom had joined him on his journey, Michael de Guano, who, by his own account, beat and raped the woman they had supposedly rescued. In another instance, 2 Taino individuals, a woman and a boy, had been rescued along with at least 20 other women, all of whom had been kept as Carib sex slaves. They explained to the Europeans that the Carib had eaten any male captives, except those 2 young who were instead castrated and kept as servant slaves until they were considered old enough to be good for eating, including the women's own children. The Europeans managed to subsequently rescue 3 of these kidnapped boys. As mentioned earlier, they also discovered the remnants of La Navidad, as well as several of the corpses of men who had inhabited it, proving Martin Alonso Pinzon correct in his belief that the men would not survive at their hastily built settlement. Despite this, the fleet discovered some gold in the interior of Hispaniola and subsequently built a second fort on the island. As you may have noted from their first interaction with the Carib canoe, Columbus took a much more imperialistic and violent approach to his colonization efforts this time around. They captured natives for minor perceived crimes, such as accusations of theft, and would have them beheaded or even dismembered as punishment. Despite their official goal of converting the indigenous people, they spent the first 2 years beating, raping, enslaving, and killing the natives before a single baptization took place. Hundreds of the natives were sent back to Spain as slaves, and hundreds more would die on the way. Columbus rather openly admitted that he'd rather see the profit from enslaving the indigenous people of the island than see them converted into fellow Christians. Columbus also established a tribute system as a way of extorting the natives for resource and gold, which was described by his own son as such, quote, "In the Caibo, where the gold mines were, every person of 14 years of age or upward was to pay a large hawk's bell of gold dust. All others were each to pay 25 pounds of cotton. Whenever an Indian delivered his tribute, he was to receive a brass or copper token which he must wear around his neck as a proof that he had made his payment. Any Indian found without such a token was to be punished." End quote. While the monarchs back in Spain recommended light punishments for missing quotas, Columbus instead had any indigenous person found without a token get their hands cut off, and many people were reported to have committed suicide out of fear or anguish at being unable to meet the impossible quotas set upon them. His third voyage to the Americas from 1498 to 1500 would not fare much better. Though this time he reached South America, which of course he still thought to be mainland Asia, he discovered that many of the men he had left behind in Hispaniola were rebelling against him, furious at his blatant lies about the amount of riches they could have expected to find there. Several of them, on their return to Spain, complained directly to the monarchs of Columbus's negligence and mismanagement, and Columbus in turn had several of his men hanged in disobedience. His incompetence, violence, mismanagement, and lies eventually caught up with him in 1500 when the Spanish monarchy had him removed as governor, arrested, and returned to Spain. While he was eventually allowed to be freed and returned to the Americas, it would not be as a governor. In 1502, after much desperate begging, Columbus was granted a chance to restore his misperceived honor by making a 4th trip to the Americas, where he was meant to find the Strait of Malacca, a stretch of water in Indonesia, and become the first man to circumnavigate the world. Obviously, this plan was born out of the belief that they were still traveling to Asia and was subsequently impossible. This time, Columbus would be accompanied by his brother Bartholomew and his son Ferdinand. They set out on March 14th, 1502. When he arrived, he noticed a hurricane was brewing and made for Hispaniola, but was denied port as he had been forbidden to land there. In the subsequent storm, 21 vessels were sunk and some 500 men drowned. Following this event, Columbus continued his search for a sea passage west, but it would not be until mid-November that he would learn from the indigenous people on the mainland Central America that there was no water route through the land, and for the first time it would seem that Columbus recognized the fact that he was on an entirely different and new continent, separate from Asia. In December, Columbus and his men were assaulted by another storm, which he described as follows, quote, "For 9 days I was as one lost without hopes of life. Eyes never beheld the sea so angry, so high, so covered with foam. The wind would not only prevent our progress, but offered no opportunity to run behind any headland for shelter. Hence, we were forced to keep out in this bloody ocean, seething like a pot on hot fire. Never did the sky look more terrible. For one whole day and night it blazed like a furnace, and the lightning broke with such violence that each time I wondered if it had carried off my spars and sails. The flashes came with such fury and frightfulness that we all thought that the ship would be blasted. All this time the water never ceased to fall from the sky. I do not say it rained, for it was like another deluge. The men were so worn out that they had longed for death to end their dreadful suffering." Shortly thereafter, in Panama, he established a garrison at the mouth of the Belen River, still seeking a strait to the west. In April, they captured a local tribe leader named Quidbian, who demanded they not travel down the river. After escaping the Spaniards, Quidbian returned with an army which managed to damage Columbus's ship so badly that one of them had to be entirely abandoned. By April 16th, becoming desperate, he made for Hispaniola, but it would not arrive. Yet another storm off of Cuba left their ship so damaged they had to be beached in Jamaica. For an entire year, Columbus and his men would be stranded on the island. While some men had fashioned a canoe and sailed to Hispaniola to seek aid, the governor there, a man named Nicolas d'Ovando, hated Columbus to such an extent that he would not permit any rescue efforts to be made. To save himself and his men in the meantime, Columbus lied and tricked the indigenous people of the island to gain their respect by doing things such as correctly predicting a lunar eclipse using a book which documented such upcoming phenomenon known as an ephemeris. In May of 1504, there was a rebellion amongst the survivors, which was won only when Columbus's brother won a sword fight against Francisco de Porras, one of the Porras brothers who led the uprising. After letting the beaten Francisco live, the rebellion calmed. On June 29, 1504, help finally arrived when a caravel arrived to retrieve the 110 surviving members of Columbus's original 147-man crew that had set out from Spain. They returned to Hispaniola, where roughly 38 of the men opted to stay rather than returning to Spain, and Columbus himself had to purchase his way back. Columbus would spend the rest of his life pleading with the Spanish crown to defend his and his family's honor, but would never again return to the Americas. He died on May 20th, 1506, aged 54. Columbus is perhaps one of the most influential people in modern history, if not for the reasons many people think. He did not discover the Americas. He was not particularly brilliant or brave, nor would he ever accomplish any of the goals he actually set out to complete. Despite this, his actions and voyage kickstarted the European age of exploration, began the violent decimation of the indigenous people of the Americas, and created an outline for the next several hundred years of colonization and conquest. By 1503, the Spanish had already begun relocation efforts of natives, a practice that would persist into modern day. These invasions would also lead to some of the largest empires in the world at the time being destroyed and conquered, such as the Inca or Aztec empires. Had it not been for the establishment of Columbus Day as an effort to calm anti-Italian aggression in the 1890s, it's possible that he would have been remembered for his efforts to enslave, rape, kill, extort, and dismember the natives of the Americas, or his failure to achieve any of his sought-after goals. But this isn't the way history went. Instead, he had been lauded as a hero, with only recent decades seeing a prominent rise in anti-Columbus education. Thank you for joining us for another episode of AAHP. This episode concludes our time with Columbus and Spain, and next time we will take a brief overview of the Americas pre-Columbus and the indigenous people who inhabited the eastern coast of what would become the USA. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review or comment letting us know what you enjoyed learning or reviewing the most, and recommend us to any other history lovers that you think may enjoy our journey through American history. My name is Isaiah, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Produced and edited by Close Tags.